Welcome to the World War II podcast with Caden and Will. Today we'll be answering a big question. Were the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki justified? To get some background on this topic, Japan had bombed Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, and this caused the U.S. to join the war. General Douglas MacArthur came up with the island hopping strategy in order to cut off supply lines to Japan and slowly take them out before the big battle happened. The big battle was the Battle of Midway, which was the biggest Navy battle ever fought in U.S. history. Japan refused to give in during the fighting. They lived by the warrior's code and would rather die than lose their honor by being captured. They would have kamikaze pilots fly into ships and lead banzai charges against U.S. ground troops. Although the U.S. was done in Europe, they still had Japan to worry about, even though the Japanese were a severely handicapped military that refused to surrender. The U.S. had sent a B-29 Superfortress to Hiroshima and dropped the first atomic bomb, and 3 days later, Nagasaki was also bombed. So, Will, in my opinion, I feel like the bombings were justified, as they had killed 2,500 of our men during Pearl Harbor and even more when we were island hopping. The author of an article I found on the website nuclearmuseum.org said, a Gallup poll taken in August 1945 found that 85% of Americans supported the bombings, 10% were opposed to them, and 5% had no opinion. Almost all of the U.S. citizens had supported the use of the atomic bomb at the time. The author also states, initial critics of the bombings were largely pacifists. This is most likely the 10% that didn't want the use of the atomic bomb. The author's point is that the percentages prove that almost all the United States agreed to drop the atomic bomb.
Well, how can you really trust what the public says in the polls when they don't even know the full truth? According to the Department of State, Office of the Historian on history.state.gov, if you read through the Potsdam Declaration, it never mentions anything about any atomic weapons. Therefore, you can assume that if the Japanese knew about the atomic weapons that the U.S. was in possession of, they would have surrendered. And then we could have just forego all of the bloodshed in Nagasaki and Hiroshima.
Well, the author of bbc.co.uk says the bomb was dropped to force a quick Japanese surrender, and American commander said it would save money and the lives of servicemen and Japanese soldiers and civilians too. They said that to continue the war for weeks or months with conventional bombing and a U.S. land invasion could have caused 1 million Japanese deaths. The commander of the United States even stated that they would have been even more deaths if we didn't drop the bombs. If we had another D-Day in Japan, the Japanese would have been completely wiped out. This reveals that without the bombs, Japan would most likely keep fighting, but suffer massive casualties and could completely be wiped off the map.
Well, according to, the bombing of cities is, I would say it's pretty barbaric. And the bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, they killed a bunch of women and children and stuff. Nobody wants any of that. But according to Document K, Admiral William D. Leahy, who's Truman's chief of staff, he said, the use of this barbarous weapon at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was of no material assistance in our war against Japan. The Japanese were already defeated and ready to surrender because of the effective sea blockade and successful bombing with the conventional weapons. So that shows that the U.S. military already had the Japanese on the ropes with the blockade and the conventional bombings, so that in due time the Japanese would have no choice other than to surrender. And then to add more evidence to earlier what I was saying about the Potsdam Declaration and not anything mentioning about the atomic bomb. So that could also be in due part to Truman's ego. So Truman, if you think about it, he was in possession of the first nuclear weapons to ever be developed. And, some people, when they have the position and have that kind of power, they want to be able to use it and see how effective it is, which is what I think he could have done. So he may have had a power trip or something, and he didn't take necessary precautions to get the Japanese to surrender. So, and that's why he didn't mention it in the Potsdam Declaration.
Well, to be fair, if they did sign it, then we wouldn't have the use of the atomic bomb. And Japan immediately rejected it, so they knew they were going to have to use the bomb. So a few days later, they dropped it on Hiroshima, and then after that, they dropped the one on Nagasaki.
And then there's another thing too, is that you could say that the U.S. didn't give the Japanese enough time to actually really think it over, their surrender, because the Potsdam Conference that occurred on August 2nd of 1945, and then the first bomb dropped on Hiroshima, that was dropped on August 9th, and then 3 days later they dropped the one on Nagasaki. So if you really think about it, there was nowhere near enough time for Japan to be able, from the first bombing to the second, to actually go in, see what happened, figure out what actually caused it to happen, and then make a decision. So I think the U.S. was too quick in unleashing the full power of the newly developed nuclear weapons.
Well, I do agree that we didn't give them enough time, but they should have known better, though. They were basically out of options. They should have just signed it, but that's their fault. And if they would have just signed it, like I said earlier, none of it would have happened. We wouldn't have had to drop it. We wouldn't have to do anything. But if we also didn't drop it, the D-Day catastrophes would have been enormous. The troops in Europe that just got done with fighting Germany would have to go down to Japan and help with D-Day, and they already relieved that Germany surrendered anyway. And it's just sending lambs to the slaughter. Like, there's no point in having that many people die.
That's a pretty good point. So to bring it back to a point made earlier, with all the evidence presented, now that I'm thinking about it, what Admiral William D. Leahy said about the Japanese already defeated and ready to surrender because of the effective sea blockade and the conventional bombings, but they didn't surrender though, even after the declaration, which, if we were to take Admiral Williams' word for it, they should have surrendered, but they kept it going.
And that's where the Japanese code of honor comes in, where they keep going until there's nothing left. They would rather die than have their country lose, or they would rather die than being captured. You know?
Well, I guess with all the evidence presented and thinking about through it logically, I guess you can say that the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were justified because of the fact that the Japanese they had the code of honor that they would never give up, they would never surrender, and fight to the death. You know, I even heard that after the war, there were still Japanese scattered around on little islands and stuff, still entrenched, thinking that the war was still going on. And when people showed up, they couldn't believe that their own country would surrender. Like, it just wasn't a thought in their head. I think there was even one dude that was like, that didn't get found until like maybe the late 1900s, who was still he still thought that World War II was still going on and that they were still fighting the Americans.
That's like his loyalty, so he just sat there the whole time and was waiting for something to happen.
Pretty much.
Interesting.
That's just what I've heard.
Okay, so we came to a conclusion that the bombings were justified due to the fact that the Japanese would refuse to surrender even if they did agree with the declaration.
And even in their losing position that they had.
Okay.
No less.
All right, everybody, thank you for listening today, and make sure to come back and tune in for the next episode of the World War II podcast with me and Mr. Will. Yeah, Miss K, you really thought we were going to kill someone off this time? Not this time, maybe next time. See ya.